Revelation 2326. From the 7th of May 1942. The will of the being indirectly determines its form. Activity. The process of change on Earth requires uninterrupted activity and is therefore a state of life. As long as the being is in this state, it advances in its development. The walk through earthly life aims at a detachment from form. The being's impulsiveness, that is its will, also determines the form, for although the will is bound for this time, the form enveloping it is nevertheless always in accordance with the nature of its will. Solid, indissoluble form conditioned by hard, unbending, easily destructible and easily overcome external form, the result of an already softer will which is willing to serve. And the activity of the spiritual, which hides itself in the form, is correspondingly. If it wants to serve, then it will be allowed to be constantly active and can quickly and easily overcome the form that envelops it. The state of inactivity, however, is like an agonizing imprisonment. The spiritual is completely free and powerful in its original state, and now deprived of freedom as well as power, it is chained, and this through its own resistance, through its own will. Until it gives up its resistance against God and turns its will towards Him, it cannot be released from captivity and therefore cannot develop its strength and be active. It has to submit to God's will. Itself once a being with free will and the right of self-determination. And yet, this agonizing state is only a means to return the spiritual being to its original state again, so that it can use its strength and will again, yet in a way which corresponds to divine will and yet earns the being itself the state of utmost happiness, whereas previously the being, due to its distance from God, no longer felt his emanation of love and only carried unkindness and hatred towards everything good within itself and was therefore blissfully unhappy. For the fulfillment of its urges only triggered increased hatred and unkindness. In the bound state the beingness is now harmless and can no longer use its power in a negative way, but it is withdrawn from it until it decides of its own accord to use it for serving activity. And now begins the ascent of this fallen and therefore bound spiritual. It is always admitted to activity as soon as it only changes its will, and therefore the movable creation is only inhabited by the spiritual, which has given up its hardest resistance and now strives upwards. Whereas the immobile in creation, matter which appears dead, does not yet betray any delightful activity of the spiritual substance in it, although it also already fulfills a serving purpose. But from which it is evident that the spiritual substance seeks to escape from form, that is, it is now willing to serve. Any willingness of the spiritual to serve earns it a less oppressive deformation, which it must now overcome itself. If it slackens in its willingness to serve, then the possibility of serving is also immediately taken from it. This is also the explanation for the fact that objects which man needs are always and constantly used, while the same objects often remain unused for long periods of time. The spiritual in them is determining through its more or less resistible will and now also has a longer or shorter stay in just this form. And thus the being's will is still decisive even though it is bound. For the willingness to serve must come from the spiritual itself, otherwise it cannot develop upwards. Amen.